You think wearing a badge makes you the law? The man in the blood-soaked hoodie said quietly, his voice carrying across the cold precinct air with the kind of absolute stillness that makes an entire room stop breathing. It doesn't. Knowing the law does. And right now, Officer Brennan, I know it considerably better than you. Nobody in that booking room moved. Not the sergeant, whose fingers had gone rigid above his keyboard. Not the officer, whose platinum blonde hair was damp with sweat beneath the fluorescent lights. Not the three strangers on the metal bench along the far wall who had all turned their heads at exactly the same moment, drawn by something in that voice that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with weight. The man standing in front of the booking desk looked like he had been dragged through the worst kind of Friday night the city had to offer. His gray hoodie was soaked through on the right side with something dark and wet. A deep gash cut across his right cheekbone, where the blood had dried into a hard, crackling crust, mixed with what looked impossibly like crushed tomatoes. His wrists bore the deep red indentations of handcuffs, only recently removed, the raw skin still carrying the shape of the steel. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, and his spine perfectly vertical the way a man stands when he has spent years in rooms where posture is the first thing people read and the last thing they forget. 45 minutes earlier, none of this had happened yet. 45 minutes earlier, Judge Damon Carter had simply been a tired man who wanted to go home. The week had taken everything Damon had and then asked for a little more on top of that, the way weeks sometimes do when you are the person a courtroom full of strangers depends on, to hold the line between chaos and something resembling order. 68 hours across 5 days. A capital murder trial that had stretched into its third week with defense attorneys who filed motions the way some people breathe, and a prosecution team that had the facts but kept tripping over their own presentation. Damon had read every brief, ruled on every objection, and carried the weight of the verdict's moral gravity in that quiet space behind his sternum, where judges learn to store things that cannot be said out loud. By Friday evening, that space was full. He did not wear the suit home. He almost never did anymore, not since his wife Elena had told him once gently and without cruelty that when he walked through their front door in the black robe or the gray wool jacket he brought the courtroom in with him and their apartment was too small for all three of them. Elena had been gone for 2 years now, a heart that gave out on a Tuesday morning in March, without any warning, and Damon had kept the habit anyway, changing into civilian clothes before he left the building, because it felt like the last instruction she had ever given him, and he was not ready to stop following it. Tonight he wore a faded gray hoodie, the kind that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft and formless. Baggy sweatpants in dark navy and a pair of running shoes with the left sole beginning to separate at the toe. He looked in the parking garage elevator mirror like a man who drove for a rideshare company or worked a late shift somewhere that required comfortable shoes, which was precisely the point. There was ink on the side of his right hand from a leaking pen that had given out mid-signature on a court order at 2 p.m, a smudge of dark blue that he had rubbed at without success. On his left wrist, slightly loose, because he had lost weight this past year without particularly trying, was a watch with a scratched face and a worn leather strap. The kind of watch that cost $43 at an airport gift shop. The kind Elena had pressed into his palm with both hands the morning of his first day on the bench, laughing and telling him that an expensive watch on a judge just meant someone was paying attention to the wrong things. He took the watch off every night and put it back on every morning. That was the whole of his ritual now. The grocery store was 4 blocks from the courthouse, a Whole Foods that occupied the ground floor of a mixed-use building in a neighborhood that had changed its personality 3 times in the past decade, currently settling into the particular brand of upscale casual that meant $12 cold brew and organic produce arranged by color. Damon went there because it was close and because the ribeye they carried was genuinely good and because on Fridays, when he was too depleted to cook anything that required real attention, a good piece of meat and something simple was the only thing that sounded like a reward rather than an obligation. He did not think about power when he walked in. He did not think about his title, his courtroom, or the 47 cases currently active on his docket. He thought about whether the marinara sauce he liked was still on the shelf, and he thought about the particular quality of silence that his apartment had at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, which was a different silence from the courthouse silence, and one he had slowly, imperfectly learned to live inside. The store was winding down with the particular tired efficiency of a place that knew closing time was coming and was beginning to metabolize that fact. A single teenage cashier leaned against her register with the patient expression of someone counting the minutes, not out of boredom, but out of pure biological need for the shift to end. The security guard, a man in his late 60s with a faded anchor tattoo on his left forearm, and the careful, unhurried movement of someone who had learned long ago that most things resolve themselves if you give them a moment, was running a yellow floor buffer in long, slow arcs near the back of the store. Damon gathered what he came for, a bundle of broccolini, a small bag of fingerling potatoes, a ribeye from the butcher case that the label told him was dry-aged 21 days, and a heavy glass jar of imported San Marzano marinara with a red wax seal on the lid that he had been buying for 3 years because it was the only one that tasted the way he remembered his grandmother's tasting, which was probably not accurate but was emotionally true. He paid at register 4, tapped his card, folded the thermal receipt and tucked it into the front pocket of his hoodie without looking at it, and picked up the brown paper bag with both arms because the jar made the whole thing heavier than it looked. He walked toward the exit at the pace of a man with nowhere urgent to be, which was the first time all week that description had been accurate. His left foot crossed the sensor threshold of the automatic exit doors. The anti-theft pedestals erupted in a high-pitched, pulsing shriek, red warning lights strobing against the glass vestibule walls, the kind of alarm that is designed specifically to be impossible to ignore, and succeeds completely at that goal. Damon stopped walking. He did not flinch, did not look over his shoulder, did not adopt the reflexive, guilty posture of someone surprised by their own conscience. He simply turned around and looked back toward Register 4, where the teenage cashier had already picked up a handheld deactivation wand and was making a small, apologetic gesture in the direction of the security guard, the universal silent language of, "I missed the sticker on something." The guard with the anchor tattoo looked up from his buffer. He looked at Damon. He looked at the cashier. He smiled with the tired, uncomplicated smile of a man who has seen this particular false alarm many dozens of times, and he raised one hand in a single clear wave, a full arm motion, unhurried, unambiguous, the kind of wave that means go ahead and means it completely. "That's all right, sir," the guard called across the 30-foot space, his voice carrying over the fading alarm. "Cashier just missed the tag on the meat. You're good to go. Have a good night." Damon gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement, the small reciprocal courtesy of two people who have just shared a slightly annoying but entirely ordinary moment, shifted the paper bag more securely against his chest, and walked through the still flashing pedestals toward the sliding glass doors which parted for him with a mechanical exhale, and hit him with the first real breath of cold autumn air he'd felt all day. Linda Okafor had been on her feet since 6 in the morning, which for a woman who had spent 22 years as a night shift nurse before her retirement 8 months ago was not particularly unusual, but which her ankles were reminding her of with increasing insistence as she stood in the grocery store's parking lot loading 3 bags into the back of her car, while her son Noah did his level best to explain why a 9-year-old boy's need to watch the last 20 minutes of a football game constituted a genuine emergency. Mom, Noah said with the gravity that only a child who has recently discovered sports can muster, pulling on the sleeve of her coat with both hands. "It's tied. It's tied right now. We have to go." "The groceries have to go in the car first, baby," Linda said, not without sympathy, tucking the last bag in and straightening up with the small, involuntary sound of a body that has been asked to do one too many things today. Noah turned around to face the store entrance, the way children do when they run out of arguments and need something else to look at. And that was when he saw the man in the gray hoodie push through the automatic doors into the cold evening air carrying a brown paper bag with both arms, the weight of it pulling his shoulders forward slightly, his face carrying the particular tiredness that Noah, even at 9, recognized instinctively as the kind that sleep alone doesn't fix. The man glanced over, the way adults glance at children in parking lots, a brief reflexive check, and for a half-second his eyes met Noah's, and the man's face did something small and genuine, a slight softening around the eyes that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to one that Noah felt it. Then, Linda reached out and pulled Noah gently toward her by the shoulder, the automatic protective adjustment of a mother whose child is standing too close to a moving lane, and Noah leaned into her without quite taking his eyes off the man in the gray hoodie, watching him cross toward the sidewalk with the slow, deliberate pace of someone ready to be done with the day. From inside the store, muffled through the glass, the alarm was still cycling down. Officer Kyle Brennan had been on the force for 4 years, which was long enough to have developed what he privately thought of as instincts, and what his training manual would have called pattern recognition, and what the civil rights attorneys who would later sit across from him in a federal conference room would call something else entirely. He was 31 years old, with platinum blonde hair cut close on the sides and slightly longer on top, in the way that was currently fashionable among men his age. Pale blue eyes that he had been told were intense and that he experienced as simply alert, and the kind of physical confidence that comes from spending enough time in a role where your presence is supposed to communicate authority before you open your mouth. He was not, in the way that word is sometimes applied carelessly, a bad person. He had joined the force because his uncle had been a cop, and because he genuinely believed in the uncomplicated way that 27-year-olds believe things, that the job was about protecting people from harm. He had written that in his application essay, and had meant it at the time. 4 years had deposited a certain residue over that original belief without replacing it entirely, the way sediment settles over something still living at the bottom of a river. He had learned to read situations quickly, and to trust those readings, and the thing about trusting your readings is that you stop questioning whether the original lens is clean. He was standing 10 feet from the Whole Foods entrance when the alarm went off, finishing a slow loop of the shopping complex's exterior that he made every 40 minutes or so on Friday evenings, because the foot traffic tended to spike, and the parking lot tended to produce the kind of low-level friction minor altercations, car break-ins, the occasional shoplifting run that was easier to prevent than to respond to after the fact. He heard the high-pitched shriek of the anti-theft pedestals. He looked toward the entrance. He saw a black man in a baggy gray hoodie coming through the sliding glass doors carrying a large paper bag, moving at a pace that was not running but was deliberate, purposeful, getting somewhere. Brennan did not look through the glass into the store. He did not look for the security guard. He did not wait one additional second for context that was available to him within arm's reach. He took a step forward, and then another, and his body had already committed to the geometry of an intercept before anything in his mind had formally decided to intercept. He planted himself on the concrete walkway 7 feet from the doors, feet shoulder-width apart, thumbs hooked behind the heavy black leather of his duty belt in the stance that communicates without words that the person wearing it has decided something, and the person facing it has not yet been consulted about whether they agree. "Hold on a second," Brennan said. His voice was level, almost friendly, the kind of level, almost friendly that has a steel frame inside it. "I need you to set the bag down and show me a receipt." Damon stopped walking. He held the paper bag against his chest with both arms, feeling the cold curve of the marinara jar through the thick paper. And he looked at Officer Brennan with the calm, measuring gaze of a man who has spent 16 years listening to people talk and learning in granular detail the difference between what they say and what they mean. "Good evening," Officer Damon said. His voice was a deep, unhurried baritone, the kind of voice that does not need to raise itself to fill a room, and it did not raise itself now. The alarm was triggered by a magnetic tag on a piece of meat that the cashier forgot to deactivate. The security guard inside cleared me to leave. "He's right there." Damon tilted his chin toward the glass vestibule if you want to confirm that. Brennan did not look through the glass. His eyes stayed on Damon's face, specifically on the hoodie, specifically on the bag, in the way that eyes do when they have already decided what they're looking at and are simply waiting for the other person to stop talking. "I didn't ask for an explanation," Brennan said, the friendliness dropping 1 degree. "I asked you to put the bag down." From the parking lot, Linda had turned around. She was not sure exactly when she had stopped moving toward the car, but she had, and Noah was pressed against her side, looking up at the 2 men standing on the walkway with the particular radar of a child who has learned through the ambient curriculum of simply existing in the world that certain combinations of bodies and tones mean something is about to happen. "Why is that man being stopped?" Noah asked quietly enough that only Linda heard. Linda put her arm around him and didn't answer, because the answer was something she understood in her chest before she could find words for it, and she reached into her coat pocket for her phone. The guard inside confirmed this. Damon said again, patient and specific, as though repetition might accomplish what clarity had not. "I've paid for these items. There is a thermal receipt in my front pocket documenting the transaction. I'm going home." "You're not going anywhere until I see that receipt," Brennan said, and now the friendly frame was gone entirely. What was underneath it, harder and more absolute? "Put the bag down." "I'm not going to put the bag down," Damon said, and the simplicity of it. No apology, no hedging, no performative deference seemed to do something to the air between them, tighten it in a way that was almost physical. "I've already explained what happened. The store security has already cleared this. If you want to investigate further, you can speak with the guard inside who is currently visible through the glass and who waved me out himself." Brennan stepped forward. 1 deliberate step closing the gap by 18 inches, which is a specific kind of message that does not require interpretation. "Suspected shoplifting," Brennan said. "You triggered the alarm. This is an investigatory detention. You are required to cooperate." "I am cooperating," Damon said, and his voice had not changed temperature by a single degree. "I'm standing here speaking with you, explaining the situation clearly. Cooperating does not mean surrendering." The escalation that followed had a rhythm to it. The kind of rhythm that happens when one person is pushing toward a conclusion they have already decided on, and the other person refuses to reach it on their terms. And the refusal, calm, reasoned, utterly immovable, registers not as compliance or defiance, but as something the first-person system does not have a clean category for, which makes it paradoxically more threatening than either. Brennan told Damon he was suspected of theft. Damon acknowledged the stop and declined to put the bag down. Brennan told Damon he would be placed in handcuffs if he did not comply. Damon said that placing handcuffs on a person who had committed no crime and had been explicitly cleared by the store's own security constituted an unlawful detention and that he would not be facilitating it. Each exchange took the temperature up by a fraction of a degree the way water heats invisibly continuously until something changes state. Noah had stopped asking questions. He was simply watching now, standing very still against his mother's side, and Linda had her phone out the camera, open, her thumb hovering over the record button, with a steadiness that surprised her, because her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her wrists. She pressed record. The timestamp in the upper corner of her screen read 8:47 p.m. "You are refusing a lawful order," Brennan said, and his voice had reached the register that was no longer a communication strategy, but something older and less controlled. The register that happens when the gap between expectation and reality becomes unbearable. "Place the bag on the ground now, or I will place you under arrest. I am refusing an unlawful search." Damon said, and the words were enunciated with the cold, exact precision of a man who has spent his entire adult life understanding what words mean and choosing them accordingly. Those are different things. I'd encourage you to understand the difference before you take another step. The encouragement landed like a scalpel. Brennan's jaw tightened. His right hand moved from his belt buckle, hovering over the polymer housing of his taser, in a gesture that was both threat and indicator, the body announcing what the mind was working toward. The radio on his shoulder hissed briefly with static from somewhere else in the city, some other Friday night's emergency entirely indifferent to this one. "Last chance," Brennan said. Damon looked at him with eyes that were dark and perfectly still and said nothing at all because he had already said everything there was to say, and what happened next would not be because of anything Damon Carter had failed to make clear. What Damon did next was not retreat, although from the outside it might have looked like it. He took one slow, deliberate step backward, placing the heel of his running shoe precisely on the threshold of the automatic door sensor, and the doors behind him responded to the motion with a soft, mechanical exhale parting 6 inches and releasing a wedge of warm interior air against the back of his hoodie. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Brennan the entire time, taking that single step with the careful, telegraphed deliberateness of a man who is performing an action for an audience and understands that the performance matters as much as the action itself. Then he stepped backward fully into the vestibule. The automatic doors hissed the rest of the way open as he cleared the threshold, bathing him in the harsh white glare of the store's interior LED lighting every detail of his face and clothing, made suddenly vivid and unambiguous. He stopped when his heels were 8 inches inside the doorframe, standing in the bright column of light, like something in a museum, and he stayed there. The store's interior is a place of business where I have just completed a legal transaction, Damon said, addressing Brennan through the open door, his voice carrying the same unhurried cadence it had held throughout this entire encounter. I am not fleeing. I am complying with your stated demand to verify my purchase. I am doing so in a way that protects both my property and my constitutional rights simultaneously, and I am giving you every reasonable opportunity to resolve this without further escalation. Then, with his left arm still cradling the paper bag firmly against his chest, he reached into the front kangaroo pocket of his hoodie with his right hand. Slowly, fingers spread the gesture, narrated by its own openness and deliberateness. Brennan's entire body went rigid on the walkway outside, his thumb driving down on the retention hood of his taser with an audible mechanical click that carried sharply in the cold air. Damon's hand emerged from the pocket holding a long strip of crumpled thermal receipt paper. He did not extend it toward Brennan. He did not offer it across the threshold. He raised his arm, pressed the receipt flat against the inside of the glass door panel with the flat of his palm, and held it there with perfect stillness, the white paper catching the interior light, every line of printed text completely legible from the outside. Ribeye fingerling potatoes, broccolini marinara sauce, San Marzano imported $14.99, total $71.43, payment approved. Timestamp 8:44 p.m., authorization code printed in bold at the bottom. You have a clear visual of my complete transaction. Damon said, his voice entirely steady through the glass. Every item in this bag is itemized on that receipt. The timestamp confirms the purchase occurred 11 minutes ago. The authorization code confirms the card payment was processed and approved. You may read every line. I will hold it here as long as you need. But I am not handing this receipt to you, and I am not surrendering this bag, and I do not consent to any search of my property. Brennan stared at the white paper pressed against the glass. He did not read it. What happened in the next 40 seconds would be documented by 4 separate cameras, and each of those cameras would capture a different angle of the same essential truth, and none of them would leave any room for interpretation. Brennan stepped forward to the threshold, and something in his face had shifted from the controlled authority he had maintained throughout the encounter into something rawer and more dangerous. the expression of a person who has run out of mechanisms and is now operating from a place that mechanisms were designed to contain. He raised his left hand and drove his palm hard against the outside of the glass door, flat and fast, directly over the receipt that Damon's hand was holding in place. The door sensors registered the motion and responded the only way they knew how. The automatic panels slid fully open. The physical barrier between them disappeared in a rush of cold air. Brennan stepped over the metal track into the vestibule, closing the distance to less than 3 feet. And what his left arm did next was not a question or a command or an investigatory action. It was a sweeping downward strike, the kind of motion that requires no justification from the person performing it in the moment they are performing it, that arrives before thought, and is followed by thought only afterward when the consequences have already been made physical and irreversible. His forearm connected with the brown paper bag cradled against Damon's chest. The paper tore. The bag dropped. The fingerling potatoes scattered across the vestibule floor in a rolling, pattering cascade. The broccolini fell soundlessly. The ribeye, still in its butcher paper, landed flat. And the glass jar of imported San Marzano marinara, the one with the red wax seal that tasted the way Damon's grandmother's sauce had tasted, or at least the way he remembered it tasting, which was the part that mattered. That jar hit the concrete floor of the vestibule at the full height of a man's chest and exploded with a sound like a gunshot, a sharp concussive crack that echoed off the glass walls and the metal doorframe and the brick facade of the building and the cold night air in every direction at once, and the sauce detonated outward across the gray aggregate concrete in a wide violent bloom of deep red painting, the floor in every direction, and the shards of glass glittered under the fluorescent lights like something catastrophically beautiful, and the smell of crushed tomatoes and cold air mixed with something sharper and more chemical, the smell of an ordinary evening becoming something else entirely. Brennan moved before the last piece of glass had stopped skittering across the floor. He drove his right shoulder into Damon's chest, wrapping both arms around the man's torso in the same motion, and simultaneously hooked Damon's left ankle with the heel of his boot in a leg sweep that was fast and practiced and completely effective against a 47-year-old man who had no warning, no counterbalance, and no chance. Damon fell. He fell the way people fall when their feet are taken from them unexpectedly, fully, suddenly, with the terrible completeness of a body that trusted the ground to still be there and found it gone. His chest and the right side of his face struck the concrete directly in the center of the spreading pool of sauce, and the shards of glass that had not yet been displaced by the force of the impact bit upward through the fabric of the hoodie and into the skin of his cheekbone, and the warmth of his own blood arrived immediately, mixing with the crushed tomatoes on the cold floor in a way that made the two indistinguishable from a distance. Brennan's knee dropped onto Damon's upper back between the shoulder blades, driving the remaining air from his lungs in a single involuntary sound. He reached back for Damon's wrists, wrenching the left arm up toward the shoulder joint, and the cold steel of the handcuffs bit down over the bone with a ratcheting sound that was completely ordinary, and somehow the worst sound in the entire sequence. Damon did not struggle. He did not tense his arms or pull against the grip. He went completely, deliberately limp. Not the limpness of a person who has given up, but the limpness of a person who understands that the most dangerous thing he can do right now is give anyone watching or recording or reviewing footage later a single frame that could be interpreted any other way. He turned his face slightly to the side, away from the larger shards of glass, and he waited for the second cuff to close, and when it did, the only sounds in the vestibule were Brennan's heavy breathing and the distant rhythmic squeak of the security guard's floor buffer somewhere deep inside the store, unbothered and entirely unaware. From the parking lot, Linda Okafor was still recording. Noah had stopped moving entirely. He was pressed against his mother's side with both hands gripping her coat, and his face had gone very still in the way that children's faces go still when they see something they do not have words for yet, but that they know with the wordless certainty that lives below language they will carry for a very long time. He was not crying yet. That came later on the drive home quietly with his forehead against the cold car window. Brennan hauled Damon upright by the short chain of the handcuffs, a motion that did not wait for the man beneath it to find his footing first, and did not need to, because patience was not the operating principle at this particular moment. Damon stumbled, fought for balance on the slick concrete with his arms locked behind him, and found it not because the situation allowed for grace, but because 47 years of living in a body teaches you something about how to hold it upright, even when everything external is working against that. The dark mixture of marinara sauce and blood dripped from the right side of his face and the front of his hoodie, leaving a wet trail across the aggregate concrete as Brennan gripped his arm and turned him toward the parking lot. "Walk," Brennan said. Damon walked. The 30 yards between the vestibule and the idling patrol cruiser were in their way, the most public 30 yards of the entire encounter, because the alarm and the sound of the jar shattering and the shouted commands had drawn the attention of the handful of late-evening shoppers who had been in various stages of returning to their cars, and they were now standing still in the parking lot, with the particular frozen quality of people who have just registered that something serious is happening and have not yet decided what their role in it is. Several of them had their phones up. The pale glow of the screens reflected off their faces in the evening dark, small rectangles of cold light tracking the movement of the man in the ruined hoodie being marched across the concrete. Brennan saw the phones. He squared his shoulders, tightened his grip on Damon's arm, and raised his voice to the level and register that he knew from training would be picked up cleanly by the microphone on his chest-mounted camera. "Stand back," he called across the parking lot, the command landing with deliberate precision. "Suspect is being detained for shoplifting and resisting lawful arrest. Please clear the area." Damon ignored the audience. He ignored the ache in his wrists, the cold air on the exposed wound on his cheekbone, the weight of the public humiliation of being paraded across a parking lot in handcuffs while strangers recorded it on their phones. He kept his spine straight and his eyes fixed on the flashing light bar of the cruiser ahead of him, and he moved with the unhurried, upright dignity of a man who has decided that what is happening to his body tonight will not be allowed to happen to his character. The patrol cruiser's lights were still cycling red, blue, throwing alternating color across the wet pavement as it pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared around the corner, and the people who had been watching began slowly to lower their phones and look at each other with the slightly stunned expressions of witnesses who are not sure what they have just seen. Linda Okafor lowered her phone too. She stood at the edge of the parking lane with Noah pressed against her side, and she looked at the video she had just recorded 4 minutes and 31 seconds, starting from the moment Brennan first planted himself in front of the man in the gray hoodie. Capturing the demand, the escalating commands, the moment the bag was struck, the fall, the handcuffs, all of it. The footage steady in a way that surprised her because her hands had not felt steady at all. Noah tugged her sleeve. Not the football game urgency of 40 minutes ago, something quieter and more serious. "Mom," he said, "is that man going to be able to come home tonight?" Linda looked at her son, 9 years old, standing in a cold parking lot at 8:45 on a Friday night, asking the one question that cut through every layer of what had just happened and landed on the thing that mattered most, with the unerring accuracy that children possess when adults are still processing the geometry of something, and the child has gone straight to its heart. She did not have an answer. She pulled Noah closer and she looked at the video again, and then she looked at the empty space where the cruiser had been, and she made a decision. She did not call the police department. She scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she had saved 2 years ago, after watching a segment on a local news program. A journalist who covered civil rights cases who had given her card out at a community meeting Linda had attended almost by accident, following a neighbor who needed company more than Linda had needed to go. She found the name. She pressed call. While it rang, she looked down at Noah, who was still looking at the corner around which the cruiser had disappeared. "I don't know yet, baby," she said finally. but I'm going to try to help make sure he does. The rear compartment of the patrol cruiser was dark and smelled of industrial cleaner and the particular closed-in quality of a space designed to be inescapable. The molded plastic seat hard beneath him and the metal mesh separating him from the front of the vehicle pressing the cold air into a smaller and colder shape than the outside air had been. Damon sat with his back against the seat and his hands locked behind him and his eyes open, looking at the back of Brennan's head through the mesh as the cruiser moved through the Friday night streets, passing the restaurants and the bars and the people having ordinary evenings, and he breathed the way he had learned to breathe in hard moments, slowly through the nose, all the way down, letting the exhale carry whatever needed to leave. The gash on his cheekbone had stopped actively bleeding. He could feel the drying crust of it tight and uncomfortable pulling at the skin when he moved his jaw. The handcuffs had begun to bite into the wrist bones in a way that had migrated from discomfort to something more specific and persistent. He looked at his left wrist, turned awkwardly against the cuffs. He could just barely see the face of Elena's watch, scratched and small and entirely intact in the middle of everything that had been broken tonight. He kept his eyes on it for a long moment, and then he looked up and out the side window at the city passing by, and he let himself think with the cool, methodical precision that had never entirely left him, regardless of what was happening to his body about what came next. He knew with the certainty of someone who had spent 16 years inside the machinery of the legal system exactly what came next. He was willing to wait for it. The 4th District Precinct at 9 o'clock on a Friday evening had the particular ambient quality of an institution that never fully sleeps, but that has distinct cycles of wakefulness. And this was one of the quieter intervals between the earlier evening rush and the later night one. The fluorescent lights doing their indifferent work over the booking area's worn linoleum, the coffee maker behind the sergeant's station producing a smell that had been building since around 3 in the afternoon and was now somewhere past coffee and approaching burnt philosophy. Sergeant Walt Doherty was a 22-year veteran of the department who had the mustache and the posture and the particular quality of tired alertness that accumulates in a person who has sat behind a booking desk for long enough to have seen virtually every kind of Friday night the city could produce. He was halfway through a cold cup of that same dark coffee, his fingers resting on the keyboard of the intake terminal with the easy familiarity of a man who could complete this particular sequence of keystrokes in his sleep, when the heavy door swung open and Brennan marched his prisoner in. Doherty looked up. He took in the picture with the patient, empirical efficiency of long experience. A man in a faded gray hoodie, baggy sweatpants, running shoes with a separated sole, hands locked behind him. The right side of his face and chest covered in something dark and wet. Doherty's brain categorized it in sequence as possible blood, then possible sauce, then definitely both the dried crust of a laceration, visible on the cheekbone beneath the darker stain of the marinara. The man was standing with his spine straight and his jaw set and his eyes somewhere between the middle distance and the plexiglass of Doherty's window, looking at neither thing specifically, and both things simultaneously the way certain people look when they have made a decision to be present in a room without being consumed by it. "Rough one," Doherty said, setting his coffee down. Shoplifting at the organic place on 5th Brennan set his chest still carrying a slight elevation from the adrenaline. He unclipped a clear evidence bag from his belt and dropped it on the pass-through tray inside a crumpled thermal receipt somewhat stained. Suspect triggered the anti-theft alarm at the exit. Non-compliant during investigatory detention. Active physical resistance. Had to take him to the ground. Doherty looked at the evidence bag. He pulled it through the slot and glanced at the receipt without touching it, noting the timestamp, the total, the length of the itemized list. Then he looked back at the man standing in front of his window. "All right," Doherty said, pulling up a fresh intake screen on his terminal. "Let's get through this. Full legal name, date of birth, and your home address." The man in the ruined hoodie let a brief silence expand in the cold air of the booking room. Not a nervous silence, not a calculating one, but the silence of a person taking a moment because they are entitled to take a moment, and they know it. "My name is Damon Carter," he said. His voice was quiet and deep and completely level, carrying in the particular way that voices carry, when they are confident of being heard without effort. Date of birth, September 2nd, 1977. Doherty typed his eyes on the screen. "Occupation: I am employed by the state of California," Damon said. "State worker," Doherty said, typing. "All right, give me 1 second." He hit enter and the database query went out cross-referencing the name and date of birth against the state employee registry, the DMV records, the NCIC running its automated checks with the flat bureaucratic indifference of a system that processes several thousand such queries per day and assigns no particular emotional weight to any of them. The spinning cursor ran for exactly 2 seconds. Then the screen changed. The top third of Doherty's monitor filled with a solid red banner. Not an error message, not a flagged record in the criminal sense, but an administrative designation he had seen perhaps 4 times in 22 years. A high-level lock placed on sensitive public official records to prevent unauthorized access and protect the privacy of individuals whose positions made them potential targets of interference. The text inside the red banner was white and bold and took up the full width of the screen. Restricted File Judicial Officer, Honorable Damon Carter, presiding. Judge, 4th District, Superior Court. Below the banner, the DM5 photograph had loaded a clean-shaven man in a tailored black judicial robe, his expression carrying the particular quality of composed authority that comes from years spent being the person in the room who decides things. Doherty stopped typing. His hands did not move to the next key. The rhythmic clacking that had filled the booking room for the past 40 seconds died completely. He looked at the photograph on his screen for a long time. He looked through the plexiglass at the man standing in front of him, the blood-soaked hoodie, the dried laceration, the deep red indentations of the handcuff brackets still visible on both wrists, the straight spine, the perfectly level eyes that had been looking at him with patient, unhurried attention this entire time, waiting for precisely this moment. The color left Doherty's face the way color leaves a face when something shifts below the level of expression, when the body understands what is happening slightly before the mind has assembled the words for it. He reached under the desk with a hand that was not entirely steady and pressed the internal alert button that would bring Captain Holloway from his office, and then he turned his head and looked at Officer Kyle Brennan in a way that had nothing to do with the collegial ease with which 2 people who work in the same building normally look at each other. "Take the handcuffs off," Doherty said. His voice was barely above a whisper pressed flat by something that was not quite horror and not quite grief, but was in the neighborhood of both. Brennan laughed, a short, reflexive sound that was pure confusion, the laugh of someone who has heard something so far outside the expected that the only available response is involuntary. "Excuse me." The guy actively resisted a lawful, "Take the handcuffs off him right now." The whisper was gone. What replaced it was the voice of a man with 22 years of authority who has just realized that authority is the only tool he has left, and he is going to use it completely. "Now, Kyle. Right now." Brennan flinched backward. The 3 people on the bench along the far wall had gone completely still. The hum of the precinct's ventilation system suddenly seemed very loud. "Take them off," Doherty said one final time, softer again, his voice dropping to the register of a man pointing at something that cannot be undone. He raised one finger toward Damon's ruined hoodie. "You just put handcuffs on the sitting Superior Court judge of this district." The ventilation kept humming. Brennan turned his head. He looked at the man standing beside him, whom he had swept off his feet in a parking lot vestibule 40 minutes ago, whose face he had pressed into a mixture of broken glass and marinara sauce, who had walked the entire way from the patrol cruiser to this desk with his spine straight and his eyes forward, who was standing in front of him right now with the calm, complete stillness of a person who has always known this was where the evening was going and has simply been waiting for everyone else to arrive. The ratchet mechanism of the handcuffs released with two small, precise sounds, one for each wrist. Damon lowered his arms in front of him slowly. He looked at the red indentations the steel had left on his skin. He did not say anything. He looked up. Captain Richard Holloway's office smelled of lemonwood polish and the ghost of many cups of coffee, and it was decorated with the particular mix of institutional certificates and family photographs that characterizes the workspace of a man who has spent 28 years building something and believes with the genuine conviction that long service can produce that the thing he has built is mostly good. There was a photo of his daughter at her college graduation on the corner of the desk, and a framed commendation from the mayor's office on the wall behind him, and a small succulent on the windowsill that his wife had given him because she said he needed something living in the room, and she was right. He stood behind the mahogany desk and looked at what had walked into his office, and the commendation and the succulent and the graduation photograph receded into peripheral irrelevance. Damon Carter stood in the center of the room. He had not sat down when Holloway gestured to the chairs. He was still wearing the ruined hoodie, still carrying the evidence of the parking lot on his face and chest, the wound on his cheekbone now, a dark, tight line of dried blood, and something more complicated. He held his hands loose at his sides and looked at Holloway with the expression of a man who has all the time in the world and intends to use every second of it. Brennan stood against the far wall with his back almost touching the wood paneling. The street-level authority that had carried him through the last 40 minutes evaporated so completely that he looked physically smaller, a man whose uniform had suddenly become something he was inside of rather than something he was. "Your Honor." Holloway began, his voice stripped of every defensive layer he might otherwise have reached for. "I cannot begin to—" "You don't need to begin anything," Captain Damon said. It was not an interruption so much as a precision correction, quiet and absolute. "Officer Brennan needs the floor." He turned to face Brennan, and what followed was not a shouting match, and not an emotional confrontation, and not any of the things that the situation by normal human logic might have produced. What it was a careful, methodical, devastating account of 45 minutes delivered in plain language that required no legal training to understand the kind of clarity that only comes from someone who has spent 16 years thinking about what words mean and what consequences flow from them. Damon laid it out the way he laid out a ruling from the bench in sequence, without embellishment, letting the facts carry the weight because the facts were sufficient. The security guard had cleared him. That clearance was visible from outside the store and had been available to Brennan from the first moment of the stop. Choosing not to look at it was not an oversight. It was a choice, and choices have meanings. When Brennan demanded proof of purchase, and Damon had provided it pressed against the glass where every line was readable. The transaction had been verified, the stated investigatory purpose had been fulfilled, and anything that happened after that moment had no lawful foundation. What happened after that moment was that Brennan put his palm through the door, let the sensor open. It stepped across the threshold and used his forearm to strike a bag being carried by a man who was standing still in a brightly lit entrance, in full view of multiple cameras complying with the stated demand, while declining to waive constitutional protections he was legally entitled to keep. "You broke a glass jar against my body," Damon said, his voice carrying no anger, only weight. "You took my legs out from under me. You drove your knee into my spine. You placed me in handcuffs. And you did all of this because I knew what my rights were and I declined to pretend otherwise for your convenience." Brennan's mouth moved once. Something began and did not complete itself. "Don't," Damon said without raising his voice. The word filled the room completely. Holloway was staring at his desk blotter with the focused, vacant attention of a man who has decided that looking directly at what is happening would not improve matters. Brennan stood against the wall and said nothing. And in the silence, something shifted in his face. Not remorse, in the full sense, not yet, because remorse requires time and reflection, and the willingness to look at yourself in a light that is very unflattering. And all of those things take longer than a single evening in an office. But something cracked. Some version of the story he had been telling himself since the moment the alarm went off, the story in which he was responding appropriately to a legitimate threat, in which his instincts were right and his actions were justified. That story developed a fracture that could not be unnoticed, and Brennan felt it happen in his chest with the precise, identifiable quality of something breaking that had not known it was fragile. "There are 3 things that need to happen now," Damon said, turning back to Holloway. His voice had returned to the conversational register, the same tone he might use to give instructions to a clerk before a hearing businesslike and without surplus. "All body camera footage from Officer Brennan's camera is preserved immediately and logged into evidence. All security camera footage from the Whole Foods location interior vestibule and exterior is formally requested and preserved tonight. And you call the FBI Civil Rights Field Office." He did not phrase any of these as questions. Holloway nodded the motion of a man who understands that nodding is the only appropriate response available to him. Damon picked up the gray hoodie from where it had settled across his frame, looked down at the dark staining on the front of it for one moment without expression, and then looked up. "I'll see myself out, Captain," he said. The door opened. The door closed. In the office behind him, the only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system, and on Holloway's desk the quiet photograph of a daughter at her graduation, smiling at a camera on the best day of that particular year. 72 hours after the groceries hit the floor of a Whole Foods vestibule, Officer Kyle Brennan sat in a windowless conference room in the FBI field office wearing a gray suit that had been purchased for his cousin's wedding 3 years ago, and had not been worn since, and which communicated in the specific way that ill-fitting formal wear communicates things that the person inside it was not accustomed to being in rooms like this as the subject of the conversation, rather than the authority within it. His union attorney sat beside him, a yellow legal pad on the table, a pen clicking at intervals that seemed to track the attorney's rising anxiety rather than any external rhythm. Agent Torres sat across the table. He had the particular professional stillness of someone who does this frequently enough to have no need to perform it, and he had not yet said anything beyond the initial introductions and the offer of water that both men across from him had declined. He turned a laptop around and pressed the space bar. The conference room filled with the ambient sound of a grocery store at closing time. Soft piped-in music, the distant beeping of registers, the squeak of a floor buffer. The footage was high-resolution, time-stamped, and entirely silent in the way that security footage is always somehow more damning than footage with sound because there is nothing to argue with, no tone of voice to contest, no claim about what was meant by what was said. Camera 1, the interior. The angle was wide and clear, capturing both the register lane where Damon had completed his transaction and the security desk where the guard with the anchor tattoo had been standing. The footage showed with unmistakable clarity the guard turning toward the exit, making eye contact with the man walking through the alarming pedestals and raising his arm in a slow, full, unambiguous wave that lasted nearly 3 seconds. The man with the groceries nodded and walked out. The guard turned back to his buffer. The reasonable, articulable suspicion for the stop evaporated in those 3 seconds of high-definition footage cleanly and completely. Camera 2. The vestibule. It showed Damon stepping back through the automatic door, pressing the thermal receipt flat against the glass panel, holding it there with his palm, the itemized list fully visible. It showed the exact duration he held it there. It showed Brennan's hand coming down against the glass from outside the door, sliding open in response to the sensor, and then the interior of the vestibule, becoming the site of everything that followed the downward sweep of the arm. The cascade of groceries, the explosion of the jar, the leg sweep the knee, the handcuffs. Camera 3, the exterior parking lot. Linda Okafor's footage, 4 minutes and 31 seconds, stable and clear despite everything her hands had been doing while she recorded it. It showed Brennan's face in close enough detail that the expression was unambiguous across every frame. It showed Damon's straight spine during the perp walk. And in the lower right corner of several frames, it showed a 9-year-old boy standing very still against his mother's side, his hands gripping her coat, watching. Torres paused the footage on a frame showing Brennan's knee between Damon's shoulder blades on the vestibule floor. He did not say anything. He slid a folder across the table. The pen stopped clicking. On the advice of counsel, the union attorney said, closing his legal pad with a sound that was quieter than the situation deserved. My client invokes his Fifth Amendment right. Torres nodded the minimal nod of a man who had expected exactly this and had built the case accordingly. Linda had not waited for an invitation to share what she had recorded. The night it happened, standing in her kitchen while Noah sat at the table with a glass of water and the very quiet expression he sometimes got when something was working its way through him, she had sent the footage to 3 places. The journalist whose card she had kept in her phone for 2 years, a civil rights legal organization whose number she had looked up while still standing in the parking lot, and a public accountability page that aggregated video documentation of police conduct, and had at the time, she sent it roughly 400,000 followers. By 36 hours after the incident, the video had been viewed by more than 2 million people. The comments ran across every register of human response legal analysis, from attorneys' testimony, from people who said they had experienced something similar and never had evidence commentary from former officers, arguments, grief, outrage. And underneath all of it, returning, in iteration after iteration, in different words from different voices, the same essential question. The man bought groceries and was cleared by security. What was the reason for any of this? The name Damon Carter appeared in print first in local coverage, then in national outlets. None of the stories that ran in the first 48 hours used his title in the headline. They ran with "Man arrested at grocery store footage raises questions." The title came later, and when it did, it changed the tenor of the coverage without changing the underlying facts, which was Damon thought privately when he read them precisely the problem, and precisely the point. The administrative leave was paid, which was standard procedure and which produced in the comment sections of various news articles. A specific category of fury that Brennan read about on his phone while sitting in his apartment on the Saturday evening after the incident. The television on but unwatched, the room carrying the particular quality of silence that descends when a person has been doing the same thing for a while and has lost track of how long. He watched Linda's video 3 times. Not the beginning or the middle, the end. The final 40 seconds, the part that showed Noah. The boy standing against his mother. The hands gripping the coat. The face that was trying to understand something it did not have a category for. Brennan had a nephew who was 8 years old. He had a photograph of them at a baseball game last summer on his phone, 3 photographs back from where he was sitting. He put his phone face down on the coffee table and stared at the ceiling for a long time, and whatever story he had been constructing and revising and reinforcing over the previous 36 hours became, in the specific way that a face can make something abstract into something concrete, much harder to continue building. The federal courtroom had the quality of permanence that is built into certain rooms on purpose: dark wood, high ceilings, the kind of light that falls at an angle and makes everything look like it is being considered seriously. It was the kind of room that reminds people, without needing to say so, that what happens here will be written down and kept. Kyle Brennan stood at the defendant's table in a dark blue suit and without the duty belt, the tactical vest, the badge, the radio, and the authority those things collectively produce. He was simply a 31-year-old man with platinum blonde hair, standing very still in a room full of people who had read the full record of what he had done and reached a conclusion about it. He had accepted a guilty plea to federal civil rights violations 3 weeks before the scheduled trial date on the advice of his attorney, who had been very clear about what a jury would do with the video. The plea was not an expression of remorse, the attorney had noted professionally. It was a strategic decision, which is a different thing, and Brennan had signed the paperwork knowing the difference and doing it anyway because the alternative was worse. The federal judge read the sentencing terms into the record with the efficient solemnity of someone who has done this many times and has not become numb to it, but has developed the discipline to perform it with exactness regardless. Permanent revocation of law enforcement certification. Qualified immunity stripped. 36 months in a federal correctional facility. The gavel came down. Damon Carter sat in the first row of the gallery in a dark suit he wore to work every day. The familiar weight of it across his shoulders. The faint white line of the healed scar running diagonally across his right cheekbone. Not disfiguring, just there. The way permanent things are there. Not demanding attention, but not going anywhere either. He watched the marshals move to take Brennan's arms. In the half-second before the marshals made contact, Brennan turned. It was not a dramatic turn. It was the slow, almost involuntary movement of a person's body making a decision before the person has consciously approved it. His eyes found Damon across the gallery, which was not difficult because Damon was in the front row and had been watching and made no effort not to be found. They looked at each other across the courtroom for a moment that lasted somewhere between 2 seconds and a great deal longer, depending on what part of the experience you were measuring. Brennan's face did not compose itself into anything that could be named cleanly. It was not an apology, and not a plea, and not a challenge, but it was something, some piece of acknowledgement that the moment had not been possible to produce before this one, and was being produced now imperfectly because it was all there was. Damon's expression did not change. The marshals made contact, and Brennan was walked toward the side door, and the door closed, and the room breathed again. Diane Reeves, Damon's attorney, touched his arm lightly and handed him a sealed envelope. Brennan had sent it through the court liaison office 4 days before the sentencing. She explained quietly. He had asked that it be delivered after. Damon held the envelope for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice covered in handwriting that had the quality of something written and rewritten, and then written again from the beginning. The pressure of the pen uneven in the way that pressure is uneven, when the person holding it is not sure they are saying the right thing, but is saying it anyway. It was not long. 2 paragraphs. No explanation for what had happened, no accounting of the reasoning or the assumptions that had produced it. Those things had been accounted for in the courtroom and in the federal case record and in 2 million views of Linda Okafor's video, and adding them here would have been its own kind of cowardice. What was there instead was something simpler and harder. The word wrong used without qualification, and then in the second paragraph a single sentence about Noah. Brennan had written that the image of the boy standing in the parking lot with his hands gripping his mother's coat was the thing he had not been able to stop seeing, and that he understood in a way he had not understood before that what a child sees becomes part of what the child carries, and that what the child had been given to carry that night was his fault, and that he was sorry for it. Damon read the letter once. He folded it along its original creases and placed it in the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket over his heart. Not because it resolved anything, but because it was real, and real things deserved to be kept. The morning light outside the courthouse was the particular quality of light that arrives in autumn before the city has fully warmed up, bright and slightly sideways, casting long shadows from the columns of the building's entrance down the wide stone steps. The air smelled of car exhaust and something leafy and faintly sweet from the trees lining the block, and it was cold enough that breath was visible. Damon came down the steps and stopped. Linda Okafor was standing at the bottom, Noah beside her in a winter coat 2 sizes larger than he needed because she always bought them big so they'd last. The boy was holding a small paper cup of hot chocolate from somewhere nearby with both hands, the steam rising from the top of it in a thin, steady thread. There had been no plan for this. Linda had simply she would explain later, felt that it was the kind of morning where you showed up for something if you could. Noah looked up at Damon with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a child who has decided that the person in front of him is worth looking at, and he asked the question that only he would have thought to ask, because only a 9-year-old asks the question that cuts cleanest through everything, that isn't the thing that matters. Are you okay? Not how did it go, and not did he get what he deserved, and not any of the things that the adults who had been following the case would have asked, weighted with their knowledge of the proceedings and the verdict and the legal architecture of what had unfolded. Just, are you okay? Damon looked at Noah for a moment. He crouched down slightly, bringing himself closer to the boy's level, and he answered honestly the way you answer a child who is asking honestly. Not completely, he said, but more than I was. Noah considered this with the serious, thorough consideration that children apply to answers they sense are important. He nodded, apparently finding this acceptable, and offered Damon the paper cup. Damon took it. He wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth. 3 months after the sentencing, the City Council voted to ratify a set of reforms developed jointly by the Police Department, the Civil Liberties Union, and a working group that included Linda Okafor as a community representative. The reforms required mandatory verification with on-site security personnel before any retail stop could be conducted, established clear guidelines for what constitutes reasonable suspicion, distinct from an alarm triggered by store equipment, and created an independent review structure for use of force incidents involving non-resisting subjects. The legislation did not mention Kyle Brennan by name. It did not need to. It described a set of conditions a Friday evening, an alarm, a man with a bag, and established that those conditions alone are not enough, and that the law must say so plainly enough that no one can claim they did not know. Linda's footage was included in the training materials distributed to every officer in the district, not as a cautionary tale framed around the subject's identity as a judge, but as a record of what happens when the system that is supposed to protect people is applied without the deliberateness that protection requires, and what it costs the people it touches when that happens. The cost, the training materials noted, is not theoretical. It is a face on concrete. It is a child's hands on a coat. It is a scar that doesn't go away. The following Monday morning, Damon Carter walked into his courtroom at 8:55, 5 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin, wearing the black robe that he had worn to this room for 16 years. He took his seat at the bench. He looked out at the gallery attorneys arranging papers, a court reporter settling in a handful of observers in the back rows who were there for reasons of their own. The morning light came in through the high windows at the angle it always came in, and the room had the quality of contained readiness that it always had before the gavel went down. His clerk called the session. Damon reached for the gavel. He paused just for a moment with the gavel in his hand, and he looked at the people in the room, the attorneys with their cases and their clients, the observers with their reasons for being there, the ones waiting in the hallway outside for their names to be called. He looked at them the way he had always tried to look at them, as people in a system that was supposed to be on their side. And he thought about what that meant with the weight of a man who had recently been on the other end of it, standing in a vestibule in a ruined hoodie, finding out firsthand what it felt like when the system arrived as something other than protection. He brought the gavel down. The session began. 2 months later, Noah came home from school and told Linda there was a new name on the sign above the door of the after-school legal aid office where she had been volunteering since the fall. He read it out loud slowly, the way 9-year-olds read things they want to get exactly right. The Friday Night Fund legal support for those who need it most. Linda explained that the fund had been established with the civil settlement money from a case she had been part of, and that it was going to help people who couldn't afford legal help when the system didn't treat them fairly. Noah was quiet for a moment, processing this with the thorough seriousness he applied to important things. Then he said he thought that was a good use of the money and went to find his backpack.
12.
The stain on the vestibule floor was gone by the following week, cleaned by the morning crew with the same solution they used on everything else, and within a month, there was no visible trace of what had happened there. People walked over that spot every day without knowing. They triggered the anti-theft alarm occasionally the way people do when a sticker is forgotten, and the guard on duty, a new guard now younger with a careful and attentive way of watching the floor, would look up, make eye contact, and wave them through with a nod that was unhurried and complete and left no room for misinterpretation. It was a small thing. It was the right thing. And every time it happened, the Friday night that had changed several lives receded a little further into the past, where it would remain, not forgotten but carrying forward in the quiet, unglamorous, essential way that real change actually moves through the world. If this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments, what city are you watching from?